We're going live. Welcome back to the Keys to Success podcast. You guys have your host, Talisa Stubbs. Welcome back. And I have my beautiful co-host, Deborah Douglas. How you doing, girl?
I am doing wonderful. It's a nice sunny day here in Texas. What about you?
It's warming up here in Virginia. You know, we had some like 98-degree days, and I was just like, I'm not with it. Like, I'd rather be somewhere where it's nice and cool. You just couldn't escape the heat. It's like no matter where you went, the heat was just like over consuming. So, anyways, I know it's the same way in Texas.
Absolutely.
So I'm excited because we have a special guest here with us today, Nic Mcgrue. There's so many amazing things to say about you, Nic. First of all, for those of you who do not know who Nic is a securities attorney, the founder of his own law firm. Like, what? That's amazing. A loving husband. And I was snooping on your Instagram that you're a member of the Forbes Council, Nic. So, Nic, thank you so much for joining us. That's pretty much what I know about you, but I know that there's so much more for you to unpack about yourself. So why don't you introduce to our audience, who is Nic the lawyer?
Yeah, thank you both so much for having me. I think that was a great intro, but a little bit more about me. So as you mentioned, I'm the founder of Polymath Legal PC. At Polymath Legal, we help real estate investors lawfully raise capital so that they can generate passive income while creating generational wealth. And so, as you said, we work with securities and exempt offerings. And so we're helping you package the documents and everything together that you need when you're doing your capital raise. We've had the firm since 2017. I think September will be 13 years. So that's pretty exciting. And the team has grown. And yeah, I'm just happy to be here and happy to share whatever knowledge and nuggets that I can share for the two of you lovely ladies and your audience.
That is awesome. We are so excited to have you. We talk about this on the podcast a lot about raising private money and kind of how to do it. And we are really focused on not only doing it, but doing it in the correct way and making sure that our paperwork is aligned to what we're trying to push out and trying to get private lenders. So we're super excited to have you and kind of share your side and how we can continue to grow.
Yeah.
Awesome. And so, Nic, before we dive into private money and everything, I just want to know, okay, you did not wake up and just say, I want to be a lawyer, or maybe you did, who knows? But take us back a little bit. How did you get into, first of all, law, but then securities? So kind of take us back. Where did this all kind of start?
All right, so we're going to take you way back if that's what we're going to do, but I love it. So I'd say the legal bug got first placed in my head. I was in ninth grade. There was a show called The Practice. It's about a law firm, like a small criminal law firm. And I really liked watching that show. And I remember I think it was Sunday nights and we'd watch it all the time. And I remember my dad one time, he was like, you could be a lawyer if you wanted to. And at the time I was like, no, that's for just like super, super smart people. Like I couldn't do that. But that's like the first time it was planted in my head. I was like, oh, well, Dad says I can do that. Maybe I could do it. That was in ninth grade. Didn't really think much about it at all during high school. But then when I got to college, I got an email that says, hey, would you like to be on this listserv where it's a group that's trying to make opportunities for more lawyers of color. And so there's going to be, meetings and you'll get to meet with attorneys and judges and stuff like that. And I was like, oh, sure, might as well. Like getting emails, what's the hurt? And so I went to some of those things and kind of was thinking about it, but not too much. But then my sophomore year, I had to take a class as Introduction to Business Law, which really was just an introduction to law. And that class just clicked with me. I liked it. It made sense. As I kind of have thought about it now, I'm very much like a rule person, an order person, systems. And so the law has rules and processes. And so it just works with my personality. And so when I got done with that class, I was like, yeah, law school is going to be what I do. So that's kind of the journey of how I got to law school and thought about law school. And then going into how I got into securities, really kind of just somewhat stumbled into it. So I can talk about this for a long time. I'll try to give us the So I graduated law school in 2009. Economy was very, very bad. It was a bad time to get out trying to look for a job. My original goal was to work for a firm for 2 or 3 years and then start my own. I had a job lined up prior to graduation, but because the economy had changed so much, that company was reorganizing and the position was no longer there. And so I was on my own and I was applying for jobs that I didn't really want for about a year. And I had some contract positions that I was doing to kind of keep me fed. But I was applying to these jobs that I really didn't want to do at all. But I was just like, I got to apply for a job. And so about a year and a half had gone by. I was doing that contract consulting stuff, and I had just had a big project in New York where they paid me well, but I saw how much they were making, and they weren't even there. And so I was like, you know what? I think that I could probably piece something together a little bit better than this. And so that's what really gave me the catalyst to launch my firm then. And so starting out, I was working in real estate and had a couple of relatively large real estate clients that like kept me fed. But then also as I was building out my business, I kind of would take a lot of various things. And so I had done earlier on, maybe the first year or two in the firm, I did a syndication for a movie project. So somebody says, hey, I have this script and I need some capital to make this movie. And so they raised about 800 grand to get the movie made. So that was my first syndication that I did. And then the second one was I had a client that is a family-owned winery. And they kind of weren't running the business too well, so they needed to pull some capital out. And so we basically sold off a small portion of the business through a syndication. So those were the first two that I did. And then fast forward maybe 2 years after that, I had a client that I was doing a whole lot of, or as a good friend, and she had a lot of single family residences. And she was saying, this management stinks. I've got 25 units, but they're all separate. And I said, you should consolidate and get, one 25 unit apartment. And that way your management's all insulated into one building. Mm-hmm. And so she comes back maybe a couple of weeks later and she's like, I liked your idea, but I'm going to go bigger. And so I think she was buying like an 80 unit or something. And she's like, and I'm going to need to raise money, like millions of dollars. Have you heard of this thing called syndication? And I was like, actually, I have. And so that was my first real estate related one. And I really enjoyed it. And then I was still kind of early-ish in my firm, and I hadn't really carved out a true niche yet. And so I liked doing that work. And then I was like, yeah, this is very unique. There's not, run-of-the-mill lawyers are not doing this. There's not a ton. And so I thought it was a good niche. And here we are years later, and now it's like 70% of what we do.
Wow.
Why do I feel like that friend is Vina Jetty?
You feel correctly. That friend is Vina Jetty.
Yeah, go big, go bigger.
Wow. So talk to all of our viewers. Talk to us about what exactly is syndication. Like, how does that happen? Because we talk about doing private lending where we just talk to someone that's in our family and we say, hey, we have a deal. Would you like to be a part of that? Talk to us about that difference when we're talking syndication.
Yeah, so syndication. So one thing I'll say is that you can, as I kind of alluded to, you can syndicate almost anything. A movie project, a winery, or an apartment building, and many other things. But syndication essentially just means that we're pooling money together. If we're talking about it in the real estate context, typically syndication is more the term used for multifamily. A lot of times if you have single family, many times you might have like one single investor or lender. Whereas with multifamily, if you're doing a raise, then you're typically going to have lots of investors as opposed to just like one or two where you might see on single family.
Got it. Yeah. So I guess, let me just be honest. If I wanted to syndicate tomorrow, do I have the credentials to syndicate?
Yeah. So there's no license that's required. I'd say the credential, so to speak, is one thing you really want to be conscious of. You're taking other people's money. And so you want to be responsible with that. And so the law actually imposes a duty on you. We call it a fiduciary duty, which means that you have to actually look out for the interests of your investors above your own personal interests. So if there's a decision that you have to make, and if you chose one way, it's going to be good for you, but bad for your investors. And the other way, it's going to be bad for you, but good for your investors. You've got to choose the way that hurts you, but is good for your investors. So I'd say that's probably the biggest qualification, so to speak. I mean, you do need to be able to, underwrite and operate and things like that. But as far as like legal requirements, I'd say just understanding that your duties to your investors.
Got it. And my investors don't have to have any type of credentials or anything of that nature either.
Not necessarily. Part of that depends. So I guess since we're getting into it, if we're talking about securities, if you are selling a security, you either must register that security or have an exemption from registration. And so registration is an expensive process, a long process, and we don't do that. We work with the exempt securities. And also, if we're thinking about real estate, you have real estate investment trusts. Those are registered securities. But outside of that, the timelines that you're needing to close a real estate deal, you wouldn't be able to start a company, get it registered, and still be able to close, because we're probably talking at least 6 months, if not longer. So we deal with the exemptions where it says, hey, you know what? We don't have to register as long as we can follow this other set of rules. So I'm kind of leading up to your question. You asked about whether there's qualifications for the investors. And essentially that depends on which exemption you're actually using, because with some exemptions, there would be requirements that the investors must fulfill.
Got it. Okay.
So like, I know, for instance, we have accredited investors and non-accredited investors. And so can you talk to us briefly, Nic, about what the difference is and why someone would need to be accredited versus non-accredited?
Yeah. So if you are accredited, you're often going to have a lot more opportunities just because the laws allow accredited investors a bit more leeway. There's multiple ways that somebody can become accredited, but the main ways that individuals usually become accredited is either through their income or their net worth. And so if we're talking income and we're talking about one single person, then they have had income of more than $200,000 for the past 2 years, and they expect to make that much or more this year. So 200 grand income. If we're talking about spouses or spousal equivalents, then we up that number to 300,000. So between the two of them, they've got to have 300,000 for the past 2 years and expect that much. So income, 200,000 as a single person, 300,000 as spouses. That's one way to be accredited. Or another way that's common is through your net worth, as I mentioned. And that is where you have a net worth of $1 million or more, excluding your primary residence. So most people's biggest asset and biggest builder of their net worth is their primary residence. We take that out and we say, without that, are you still having a net worth of 1 million or more? And if so, then you're accredited. So that's what accredited is. And then, so if you don't meet that, you're unaccredited. But we don't just say accredited, unaccredited. We have a kind of middle category as well that we call sophisticated investors. These are investors that also, they're not accredited, so they don't make that 200,000 or have that $1 million net worth, but based upon their education, their investment experience, their work experience, or working with a financial planner, they possess the resources to determine the risks and the merits of this deal and whether it makes sense for them. So Deborah, going back to your question about credentials or qualifications, that's what I was alluding to as certain raises. We allow sophisticated investors, but you've got to make sure you're qualified and actually indeed are sophisticated or accredited if that's what's required as well.
Got it. Okay. So ideally, based on what you're saying, we would need to get registered first, like go ahead and start creating that before I find the deal, or you do that kind of at the same time?
So it depends on what you're trying to do. So as I mentioned, technically we call any pooling capital is theoretically a syndication, but in the industry, people typically refer to syndication as you're purchasing a specified asset. So we know what asset's being purchased, we know how much is, et cetera. Whereas with a fund, with that one, you're raising capital and you don't know what the asset is just yet. So to answer your question, you don't necessarily, it just depends on your structure. You're not absolutely required to have an asset identified, but if you don't, then it's going to change the structure of how you're raising quite a bit.
Got it.
Okay.
These are really great.
I know, right? I know you're like taking notes. I'm trying to take notes. I am. Okay, Nic. So let's say that I find a property. Actually, you know what? I just saw a 21-unit hotel in Myrtle Beach. And let's say I get it under contract and I need to raise $1 million, but I don't want to raise it from individual private money lenders. I want to put together a fund and have people invest in the fund. So those investors, depending on how I structure it, will determine whether they need to be accredited or not.
Yeah, which exemption you choose is going to determine that.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah. And there's lots of exemptions. The common ones that are often used, at least that I use a lot for real estate clients, it falls under the umbrella of what's called Regulation D. And within that, there's 506C as in cat and 506B as in boy. So with 506B, with 506B, you must know all of your investors before they invest. So you must have a pre-existing substantial relationship. So you knew them before the deal was on the table, and you have a good idea as to whether they're accredited or sophisticated and the reasons why. So with 506B, again, all of your investors must have that pre-existing relationship. You can have an unlimited number of accredited investors, again, as long as you have that pre-existing relationship. Plus, you can get up to 35 sophisticated investors. So that's those people that are unaccredited, but they possess the resources to determine the merits and the risks. So 506B, pre-existing relationship with all investors, an unlimited number of accredited investors, plus up to 35 sophisticated investors. So that's the requirements for that exemption. And then we contrast that with 506B, because a lot of times when I talk about this, people say, wait, I can't go out and meet people and have them invest. Under a 506B, correct, you cannot do that. But you got another option, 506C. With this one, you're allowed an unlimited number of accredited investors. You also can do general solicitation, so you can advertise. But what you're giving up, or I wouldn't say giving up, but the trade-off is that every single one of your investors must be accredited. So you don't have to have that pre-existing relationship, but every single one of your investors must be an accredited investor.
Okay. So I have a question, Nick, because a question has been coming up, especially like in my immediate family. People don't have like hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars to invest, but I've got a cousin who has $10,000. I have a brother who's got $15,000, and I'm trying to figure out what I can put their money into collectively that they can invest in. And so when we talk about smaller amounts like that and creating funds, have you seen funds created for small dollar amounts like that?
I haven't, just because the costs are going to eat up all of your raise. So if you're looking, so we don't try to be the bargain basement firm, but we do use systems and technology. So I think that we have a good value proposition, and our costs are on the lower end of what I've seen. And so for us, if you're doing a fund where you have an unidentified asset, that's going to start at $10,000. And when you add in all the filing fees and notice filings and things like that, you could very easily be at $25,000, $30,000 for the cost. And so if you're only raising even $50,000 or even $100,000, that's just not going to make sense, because you're raising money basically to pay me, which is what the goal is. So I typically don't see raises that small. And kind of this made me think of one thing that I often tell clients even is that when they're doing a syndication or a fund, I often say, look, there's no legal requirement for a minimum investment, but you probably want to set that number at 25 or maybe even 50, because there's cost to taking on that capital. So let's say that by the time let's say that you had to pay an underwriter, you had somebody help with due diligence, you paid an attorney, you paid an accountant. And so maybe you might be 60, 70 grand in of expenses in getting this together. And so theoretically, if you have, let's say you've got 10 investors, that means that you're paying $7,000 per investor, obviously not directly, but you could divide it up that way. And so you wouldn't want to have an investor that's paying $10,000, because that basically means that you're getting $3,000. You're paying $7,000 to get $3,000. And so it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So while there are no minimums, there is a practical minimum that you at least want to be thinking about, because there is a cost to taking on this capital.
Got it. I do have a question. What would you say is a common legal challenge that you face when you're dealing with raising capital, and how do you help navigate some of these issues?
Common legal challenge. There's lots of them. Let's think of one last point. Man, common legal challenge. I think kind of the stuff we're talking about, I think it's very important. I know it's very self-serving to me to say this, so I'll get that out in the front. But I do think it's very important for you to talk with your securities attorneys in advance, because if you do certain things without knowing which exemptions you plan to use, you could make it to where you're precluded from using certain exemptions. Wow. And so if you don't know that let's say that I don't know that I'm going to do a 506C yet, but I start advertising. Well, if I do that, I cannot do a 506B anymore. So talking with your team in advance and kind of have an idea of your structure so that you don't do things that pigeonhole you or corner you into certain areas that you may not have chosen otherwise. So I'd say that's one big legal thing I see a lot, and that we help with quite a bit. I'd say a practical one that I see a lot is that the attorneys, we only help with the legal parts. Now, I've seen enough to where I can tell you if something's like way out in left field, but you don't want me doing your underwriting. I've had some clients that say, okay, so do you help with underwriting, or what types of returns should we give? And I'm like, that is a you question, or it's definitely not a me question. Now, again, though, I can see, like, if I have a client that says, oh yeah, we're doing a 90-10 split in favor of the managers. So the investors get 10% and the managers get 90. I would at least point out and say, hey, it's your deal. And there are worlds in which that can make sense. But I'd say, hey, look, what I'm typically seeing is like 80-20 or 70-30 in favor of the investors. And so you got that way flipped. So I just action them and say, hey, just make sure that this is not going to be something that turns your investors off, because the market, at least the market that I see, has better options out there. So I can give like anecdotal tips, and if things just seem way out of whack, but I can't tell you, you don't want me to tell you what your split should be. You don't want me to do your underwriting, because that's not the skill set that I have. So yeah, I think what I'm getting at is that the practical issue a lot of people have is that you really need to understand your deal. You come to us and say, look, this is what our plan is. This is what we're planning to do. This is why we're doing it. This is our underwriting. This is all of our stuff. Now, how do I do this legally? And we can help with that part. But you've got to have the plan, the structure, the general idea, and the numbers in place, because we don't assist with that, because we shouldn't be assisting with that.
Got it. And let me ask you this: when you do help the investor and the manager put this all together, how long are you seeing the terms that you normally see of people holding their money in the deal?
Part of it varies by industry. Most of my clients are real estate, and so that I'm still seeing in anywhere between 3 to 7 years, and more commonly probably like 5 to 7 years is usually what I'm seeing. Now, if I have some clients that they'll do like venture capital funds, and so those are going to be like 10, 15-year funds, because Facebook was probably 10, 15 years old before it actually made $1. And so those are going to have a much longer runway. And so that's why I said it kind of just depends on the industry and maybe even the investment thesis as well. Because if what you're investing in, it has like a 10-year lifespan, then you're going to be much longer than, whereas real estate typically it's like that 3 to 7 year range, and then you're selling it off at some point. And if that's the plan, at least that's what I see a lot.
Got it.
So I have a question, because I know that we're talking about real estate, but you've mentioned a few times that you've helped people raise money for other projects outside of real estate. And so if somebody's listening and they're trying to raise money for, let's say they want to produce a movie. With real estate, we actually have a physical asset that has a promissory note, that has a recorded mortgage. We just have all these securities in place. What securities are in place when you're raising for a business outside of real estate?
It's mainly contractual. But one thing I'd say also is that with multifamily, you're also not having any liens or any interest on title as well. So that also is just going to be contractual. With multifamily, you're not taking a debt position, you're taking an equity position. And so with that, you're just part of the company. So if the company does well, then you get your slice of the pie. If the company doesn't do well, then your slice of the pie is going to be much smaller, or maybe might not exist. So in the larger syndication world, you're not going to be any more or less at risk for going from real estate to entertainment or something like that, or at least regarding security devices.
Gotcha. Oh, that's good to know. Okay, good. And I've got another question. So, Nick, in your experience, what are some key factors that make like a real estate project attractive to potential investors?
One big one is tax advantages. That's a big one, especially when you're looking at larger syndication. I have some clients that's one way that they raise a lot of capital, because if you have a wealthy person that's going to have a big tax bill, they might not even care too much about how well this investment's going to do, because they know that I'm going to get a big tax break. So with multifamily apartments, for instance, you can do depreciation, and you can do what's called a cost segregation study. And what that is essentially your normally depreciation, I think, is like around across 27 and a half years, I think. Don't quote me on that. I'm not the tax specialist, but so, and the theory behind this is, right, like if I have carpet, it's not going to last forever. At some point, I'm going to have to replace that carpet. And so it's the value of that carpet is getting less and less. And so many items or things within a apartment, the standard, I think, is 27 and a half years. But if you do a cost segregation study, you can get a lot of stuff with the depreciation in the first year or the first couple years. And so you can make it look like I gave you $100,000, and you can make it look like I have a negative $100,000 return. That's just on paper, though. I'm not losing $100,000, but because I'm getting a portion of that depreciation, you're going to give me a tax document that makes it look like I lost $100,000, which means my taxable income is going to be $100,000 less. And that, you know, depending on my tax bracket, that could be 40, 50 grand that I'm saving right there. And so even if the deal gets $0, I save 50 grand, and I might be pretty happy about that.
I would take that in a heartbeat.
Yeah. Okay, good. That's good. All right. So, I had a couple more questions, but I do want to ask this question, Nic. And just because, you know, we are in this space and we don't see a whole lot of people that look like you in this space. And so as a Black attorney in this industry, have you faced any unique challenges or opportunities in your career? And would you like to share?
Yeah, I think I've had the issues that you would think with people like not thinking that I'm the attorney or thinking that I'm not that knowledgeable. And at this point, I'm kind of like, I don't care. That's your loss. So it's out there. I try to, you know, one thing that's been great about having a firm that's grown and kind of can run itself is that while I am building business and I do care a whole lot about my clients and want to keep them happy and things like that, I'm not in a position where I have to take every client. And so I'm very okay in understanding that some clients just are not for me, and that's perfectly okay. And so when I get clients that have those issues, I'd say, yeah, this might not be a good fit, and that's okay. Go with God, and good luck to you. Hopefully you'll learn some stuff and kind of unlearn some of those ways that you're dealing with. But yeah, we don't have to work together, and I'm okay with that. Whereas earlier in my career, I still would have done that, but I would have been feeling like I was losing something. Now I feel like I really am gaining something. I'm like, ooh, dodge that bullet kind of thing.
I love that. That's the value add of, you know what you're doing. You're confidently in your own lane. So it doesn't matter who works with you or not. You're going to still be blessed and still take care of who's in front of you. That's awesome.
I love that.
I do have another question. Oh, go ahead, Talisa.
No, go ahead, Deborah. Go ahead.
Because I'm in Texas, Talisa is in Richmond. Do we have to have someone that's a securities attorney in our state, or does that matter?
Wonderful question. So the exemptions I talked about, like the 506B and 506C, those are federal exemptions. So the answer to your question really ultimately depends on what type of exemption you're going to use. So we have clients that are all across the country because we're helping them with federal securities. And most, not all, but most federal securities laws preempt the state securities laws, which means that if you're following the federal laws, then you don't have to follow your state's securities laws. Now, there are what's called intrastate exemptions, meaning that I'm located in California. So if I had a client that said, hey, we're raising capital and all my investors are in California, we could do a California specific exemption. And so if you're doing something like that, you would need to have an attorney that's in the state where you're doing that. But if you're having investors across the country, then federal exemptions are probably going to work better for you, in which case it's going to be the same regardless of what state you're in.
Got it. Nice. Thank you.
Good. So in better words, Nic can be your securities attorney if you would like that.
I think I hope you're ready for a new client.
Nic, are you taking on new clients?
Yes, always. We're growing. We're ready. We're revved up, ready to go.
Awesome. Tell the people how they can reach out to you, how they can book an appointment with you to get on your schedule.
Yeah, so probably the easiest way is look at my name right here. That's my Instagram handle, @Nic the Lawyer. And on there, you'll have a link to our website, link to scheduling, all of our info. So you can find me there. And you can also find us at polymathlegal.com. So that's POLYMATHLEGAL.com. And that's our website. And again, you can schedule a calendar appointment. You can message us, and our phone number is on there as well.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, one more thing, Nic. We've got somebody out here who is really wanting to raise capital. They've got all the connections, but they've got that whole imposter syndrome, and they've got the whole analysis paralysis. What would your advice be to somebody who's in that predicament right now?
I actually was just talking about this yesterday. If we got a little time, I'll tell a fairly quick story. But the answer is fake it until you make it. But I'll tell you kind of what I mean with that. We were talking about how I started my firm, and I was fairly young. I was also a fairly new lawyer, hadn't ever actually ran a business at all. And so I remember sending my very first invoice, and I think it was like $1,800. And at the time, if I had $4,000 a month, like I'm very comfortable living. So I'm like $1,800. That's like a half a month's living expenses. And so I'm like making it, and I'm like shaving some time off to like make it a little bit cheaper. And I'm like, are they gonna be mad? Are they gonna be upset? Like what? And I finally was just like, send. And then the client called me like a day or two later and was like, hey, we need you to do this contract and that contract. And oh yeah, I got your invoice, so it'll get out tomorrow. And like just breeze through it. And I was like, wait, that worked? Hold on, that worked? And so then the next time I was like, okay, I think I can just press send a little bit quicker. And now I'm just like, send. Where's the money? Send it. You know it's fake it right now. So you fake it. And what I mean when I say fake it is, force yourself to push through that. And as you do it, it gets more and more and more comfortable to where you're not faking at all. Like now I'm not at all concerned or scared to send an invoice. So you kind of, it's hard, but you got to push through that uncomfortableness. And eventually you just get very comfortable, and it's not uncomfortable at all anymore.
Yeah, I'm so happy you shared that, because so many of us new entrepreneurs are going through that same thing of like, what is my value? I don't want to overcharge. I don't want to undercharge. But once you know your value and you continue to do it, just do it scared, because there's going to be a blessing on the other end.
Yep.
Exactly. And then Nic, one more thing. How important is having a strong support system? I know that you have your wife. How instrumental was your wife in you being able to become a success?
Yeah, very. Like my wife, my friends, my family. It's very like any entrepreneur, you need a support system, because it's hard. Even still, like again, the firm's doing pretty well, but I still have those days or weeks or months where it's difficult. And you're gonna fall flat hard on your face many times. The thing that makes a good entrepreneur is they get up a little quicker than everybody, and most importantly, they get up every single time nonetheless. But yeah, support, whether it's your spouse or friends or family or peers. I think that's another good place to find support, is peers, people that are going through the same thing, because they can offer different support than like my wife can, because she's not doing real estate and not in the entrepreneurial space so much. But with friends that are, they'll be like, oh yeah, I've been there, or oh yep, I've had days like that, or they just know kind of what's going on. So I think support's huge for sure. It's like being cliche, but it really does take a village.
Yeah, man, like Deborah already knows, like girl.
Seriously. Yeah.
I don't know. Well, Nic, thank you so much for joining us. This has been so informational. I hope that you come back on the show. But for those of you guys who are looking for a securities attorney, sorry, my dog is just deciding to shake like right here, right now. But for those of you who are looking for a securities attorney, be sure to follow Nic on Instagram. His Instagram handle is here, but if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, it is at Nic, Nic the lawyer. That's at Nic the lawyer. And Nic, is it the same thing on Facebook too?
Yep, you'll find me there on Facebook as well. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. And you guys can schedule an appointment with him and get all of your entity structure for your capital raise set up the proper and legal way. So thank you guys. We will see you next week. Bye.
Bye. Thank you, Nic.